The card was never stolen. The employee still has it. It is in their wallet right now. They used it this morning. They will use it this evening, and they will never know that between those two moments, someone else used a copy of the signal it produces to walk through the same door. This is the core idea behind a replay attack, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we go anywhere near the technical details. The attacker did not defeat the authentication system. They did not pick the lock. They did not tailgate through the door before it closed. They acquired a valid authentication signal, one that was produced by the legitimate user, at a legitimate moment, for a legitimate purpose, and presented it again somewhere it was never meant to appear a second time. The system accepted it, because the system had no way to distinguish between the original use of that signal and the copy. Now move that idea into software. Authentication tokens, session cookies, API request signatures, Kerberos tickets, password hashes transmitted over a network. Every one of these is an authentication signal that a system accepts as proof of identity, and every one of them, if captured, can potentially be replayed, presented by an attacker who never had the underlying credential, to a system that cannot tell the difference between the original and the copy. The question is not whether replay attacks are possible, it is where the window is, how wide it is, and whether the system was designed with any awareness that it exists. It is worth being precise about what makes replay distinct from the attacks we have covered in the last two videos. Bypass attacks target the verification event itself, relaying credentials in real time, fatiguing users into approving push notifications, stealing the session token that verification produces. The attack is about the process of authentication. Impersonation produces a false artifact and gets the system to accept it as belonging to a legitimate identity. The attack is about the artifact's apparent origin. Replay is different from both. The artifact is real. It was produced by the legitimate user, through a legitimate authentication process, at a legitimate moment. The attacker does not need to construct a fake, and they do not need to intercept the real-time verification process. They just need to capture the artifact after it was produced, and present it again later. This distinction matters because it changes what the defense has to do. Stopping brute force requires rate limiting and lockout. Stopping impersonation requires tighter binding between artifacts and their intended subjects. Stopping replay requires the system to be able to detect that an artifact is being used outside the context it was originally valid for, the wrong time, the wrong place, the wrong session, the wrong recipient. That detection requirement is harder than it sounds because the artifact itself is completely genuine. There is nothing about it that looks wrong. The only thing wrong is the context in which it appears. The oldest form of replay attack targets credentials or tokens transmitted over a network. Before TLS became ubiquitous, plaintext protocols transmitted authentication signals that could be captured by anyone with access to the network path, a packet capture on the same segment, a compromised router, a malicious access point. Once captured, those signals could be replayed against the same server to authenticate as the original user. The most damaging historical version of this is NTLM Relay, a Windows authentication protocol that transmits a challenge-response exchange rather than the password itself, but where that exchange can be captured and relayed to a different server, causing the victim's machine to authenticate to a server the attacker controls on the victim's behalf. The victim's credentials are never revealed. The authentication is never forged. The attacker simply positions themselves in the middle, captures the exchange in real time, and relays it to whatever they want to authenticate to. NTLM Relay is not a historical curiosity. It remains one of the most reliably useful techniques in internal network penetration, decades after the underlying vulnerability was understood, because the environments in which it works are still common. Disabling NTLM in a large Windows environment is a multi-month project with dependency chains that most organizations have not completed. TLS protects traffic in transit. It does not help if the attacker is already on the network and can perform a relay attack faster than the session can detect the anomaly. When a user authenticates to a web application, the server issues a session token, typically stored as a cookie in the browser. That token is the proof that authentication happened. Every subsequent request carries it, and the server accepts it as the identity for the session. An attacker who steals that cookie, through malware on the endpoint, through an XSS vulnerability in the application, through a network interception on unencrypted traffic, does not need to authenticate themselves. They inject the stolen cookie into their own browser, and from the server's perspective, the session is live and legitimate. This is a replay attack on the session token. The token was genuine when it was issued. It is being presented again, from a different client, in a context the original user knows nothing about. Pass the hash and pass the ticket are the enterprise equivalents of this. Pass the hash captures a Windows password hash from memory and replays it against other systems that accept hash-based authentication without ever cracking the underlying password. Pass the ticket captures a Kerberos ticket from memory and presents it to services that trust the Kerberos infrastructure, granting access to every resource the original user's ticket authorizes. In post-breach lateral movement, these two techniques account for a significant proportion of how attackers move from an initial foothold to domain-wide access. The credentials are never cracked. They are replayed. APIs present a specific replay surface that is distinct from session-based authentication, and it is one that developers frequently underestimate when designing authentication for their own services. When an API request is signed with an HMA signature, a request token, or a signed DGBTA, the signature proves that the request was created by someone who holds the signing key. What it does not automatically prove is when the request was created, or that this specific request has not been received before. An attacker who captures a signed API request can replay it. The signature is valid. The payload is unchanged. The server has no way of knowing whether this is the original request or a copy, unless it was designed to check. The consequences depend on what the request does. A replayed read request is mostly harmless. You get the same data twice. A replayed write request creates duplicate records, double charges a payment, or triggers the same action multiple times. A replayed administrative request, rotate this key, create this account, delete this resource, has the full effect of the original request, potentially with no one watching. Timestamping and nonce inclusion, embedding a unique identifier and a creation time in every signed request, and rejecting requests with timestamps outside a narrow window or nonces already seen, close this gap completely. Both are simple to implement and frequently absent. The deepest category of replay attack targets the authentication protocol itself, rather than the tokens it produces. Kerberos, the authentication protocol used in Windows Active Directory environments, was specifically designed to be replay resistant. It uses timestamps, short-lived tickets, and session keys to ensure that captured authentication material cannot be reused. The design works when clocks are synchronized and tickets are short-lived, but Kerberos has a class of attack, Kerberosting, that turns the ticket system against itself. Service tickets in Kerberos are encrypted with the service account's password hash. An attacker who can request service tickets for any service account can do so without any elevated privileges, take the encrypted tickets offline, and attempt to crack the encryption to reveal the underlying password. The ticket is legitimate. The request to obtain it is legitimate. The cracking happens entirely offline, generating no authentication events at all. Golden ticket attacks take this further. If an attacker compromises the domain controller and extracts the KRBTGT account hash, the master key used to sign all Kerberos tickets, they can forge their own tickets for any user, with any privileges, valid for any duration. These forged tickets are cryptographically indistinguishable from genuine ones. They will be accepted by every system in the domain, and because they can be made to last for years, rotating passwords and resetting accounts does not invalidate them unless the KRBTGT hash itself is rotated, which most organizations do rarely or never. Every replay attack exploits the same property. The authentication artifact is valid independent of the context in which it is being presented. A replay attack does not need a forged credential or a broken encryption scheme. It needs a valid authentication signal and a system that has no memory of having seen it before. The defenses, time limits, nonces, channel binding, credential scope all work by giving the system that memory, by making validity contingent on context that an attacker who only has the artifact cannot reproduce. What they share with everything we have covered in this series is that they require deliberate design. Systems that do not think about replay during design accept replayed credentials after deployment. And by then, the cost of adding the missing context binding is almost always higher than it would have been to build it in from the start.